Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time for today's launch webinar on our new report on greening digital companies, monitoring emissions and climate commitments. The press release for the launch was published yesterday, and we'll post the web link to the report in our chat. My name is Lourdes Montenegro, and I am leading the World Benchmarking Alliance's work on the digital and the urban sectors. I am very happy to be here with you today and excited to talk about the findings of our report and hear from our speakers who will be providing different perspectives on the topic of the report. So just a few more points before we get started. We may have time for questions and answers towards the end of this webinar. So please use the chat function to send us your questions. And if you miss anything, don't worry. We'll be sending around a link to the recording when it's available, and also the slides for those speakers who will be using slides. We will also prepare a webinar report on the ITU event page, the same one that you used to register. And then may ask everyone to add their affiliation to their screen names, and to also turn on your cameras so we can take a quick picture of the event. The report is the result of a collaboration between the International Telecommunication Union and the World Benchmarking Alliance. And just a few words about this organization, starting with our partner. The ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communications Technologies, founded in 1865. ITU allocates global radio spectrum and satellite orbits and develops technical standards that ensures networks and technologies seamlessly interconnect. With and through its 193 member states and over 800 sector members, including digital companies, it helps improve access to ICTs worldwide. We are involved, ITU is involved in a number of climate change activities, including developing international standards supporting the sustainable use of ICTs. So ITU has partnered with others to set the ICT sector on a clear GHG emissions reduction pathway in line with the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. Just last week during the World Telecommunication Development Conference, WTDC, that took place in Kigali, Rwanda, over 2,000 participants from over 150 member states reaffirmed the important role that ITU has not only in highlighting and supporting the use of ICTs for sustainable development, but also to address and monitor the impact of digital technologies and services on the environment. So the World Benchmarking Alliance, which I represent, was launched in 2018 and is a nonprofit organization that assesses the world's most influential companies' performance on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The WBA identified 7 transformations to put the world on a sustainable path to achieve the SDGs. To turn these transformations into action, the WBA develops benchmarks to assess 2,000 of the world's most influential companies. This includes its digital inclusion benchmark to evaluate the world's top 200 tech companies on their contribution towards an inclusive and trustworthy digital transformation, and its climate and energy benchmark, measuring corporate progress against the Paris Agreement. WBA insights serve as an accountability mechanism incentivizing companies to become successful drivers of change to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. The work we will discuss today is critical for our understanding of how to deal with one of the world's most threatening challenges, the climate crisis. Just these last few weeks, we have witnessed what the World Meteorological Organization has called a foretaste of the future, with heat waves starting earlier and becoming more frequent and more severe because of record concentrations of heat-trapping greenhouse gases, including in many parts here in Europe. Again, our report is timely, and the kind of information that we are publishing through will be increasingly needed. With this, I would like to turn to our first speaker, Rosie Mcdonald. Rosie is an e-waste data officer at the Environment and Emergency Telecommunications Division of the International Telecommunications Union. Rosie's work at ITU focuses on green and sustainable digital transformation by providing capacity building and research to address environmental challenges related to climate change and e-waste. Rosie, please take the stage.
Thanks, Lourdes. And next slide, please. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining today, and I'm very happy to be sharing the results of our new report, which is now available to download on our website. I shared the link in the chat. So why this report? Digital companies are playing a notable role in the race to a carbon-free planet. From huge purchases of renewable energy to investment in carbon removal to issuance of green bonds to lobbying, these companies are really at the forefront of efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Digital products and services are also having a significant impact in enabling emission reductions across our sectors. At the same time, rapid digitalization is driving demand for digital products, resulting in rising electricity use. While COVID led to a global drop in electricity use in 2020 for the first time in a decade, it is estimated that we saw a rise of about 10% across the IT sector. So where electricity use is not matched by renewable energy, it is resulting in higher emissions. And this report was the first to document the emissions and targets of the world's leading tech companies. So next slide, please. So in terms of the framework, we assessed 150 companies through the World Benchmarking Alliance for its annual digital inclusion benchmark. As part of that assessment, climate data was collected from company ESG reports. These ESG reports used climate data, which are found in the annex to our report. The table here shows how companies have been grouped by region, as well as three sub-industries within the digital sector. These are hardware, telecommunication services, and IT services. East Asia, North America, and Europe are really the powerhouses of the digital economy and the major leaders in terms of the tech firms headquartered in these regions. Next slide, please. So in terms of the framework and methodology, the report uses the same methodology followed by most of the companies, the corporate accounting and reporting standard for the greenhouse gas protocol. Emissions data are broken down into three scopes, which is shown here. A figure I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Scope 1 and 2 are companies' operational emissions from the use of fuels and electricity, and most companies report at least this. It is important to note that there was a revision to Scope 2, allowing companies to report two different figures, a location figure based on the default grid emissions factor and a market figure based on proven renewable electricity which companies purchase. Scope 3 refers to companies' upstream and downstream activities. Consisting of 15 categories, Scope 3 is really important to measure for companies to understand their entire emissions footprint, but is also sometimes the most challenging scope for companies to measure. Next slide, please. So in terms of the path to decarbonisation, this involves several processes. For example, the measurement of a company's emission inventory, establishing a target, reducing energy use through efficiency measures, working with supply chain suppliers to reduce their carbon footprints, and contracting renewable energy. So finally, after all avoidable emissions have been eliminated, some digital companies offset remaining emissions in various ways, such as rainforest protection, biomass, cook stoves. Next slide, please. So we found gaps in the availability and depth of the climate data from our report. So 2020, mainly government-owned or privately held companies report no emissions data. Scope 2 disclosure is inconsistent. Although the Greenhouse Gas Protocol calls for both location and market-based emissions, some companies report only one, and without specifying which it is. Some also do not report at all, especially Scope 3. So not all, and it's not really easily calculable in categories. And those that do are often like business travel, which are a lot more easy to calculate. So it is recommended that climate data be assured by third party, as well as we noticed that there were some errors made by some companies. And although suggestion is standalone reporting, explaining calculation methodologies used, disclosing a time series of emission data, and including verification statements. One good example is Swisscom, which follows the ISO 14064 methodology, the international standard for reporting and verification of greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So in terms of targets, 86 of the companies which had established an emissions reduction target. These targets varied quite widely by ambition, scope, and also measurement. For example, 38 companies plan to reduce all their operational emissions to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030, while others have targets a lot further into the future. Some companies have intensity-based targets, which make it impossible to forecast absolute reductions. And there are cases where the intensity ratio is improving, but emissions continue to rise. Not all companies include also their entire footprint in their target reductions. Among about 60 companies with non-intensity targets and a 2030 or earlier target end year. So it's forecast that operational emissions will drop around 60% from 53 million tonnes to 22 million by 2030. Next slide, please. So just to touch on the energy use, so many digital companies like those in other sectors are reducing energy use in their facilities through the use of sensors to control temperatures, constructing green buildings, and also converting to electrical vehicles. There are also energy reduction features specific to the digital sector. For instance, 5G networks are over 6 times more energy efficient per unit of data than 4G. Similarly, fiber broadband is at least 100 times more energy efficient per unit of data than copper-derived broadband services. So there's more of a mixed picture. Also with data centers, so power use efficiency, so PUE, has reached its limit in older data centers where easy energy efficiency gains have already been achieved. But on the other hand, newer data centers and hyperscale ones are still reducing this and have closer to PUE values of 1. Next slide, please. So in terms of the supply chain, this accounts for the largest proportion of upstream emissions. For some companies, companies are working with suppliers to report emission data, procure renewable energy, and adopt targets. The CDP supply chain project provides support for members to request their suppliers to report environmental data through the CDP. For example, Samsung asks their suppliers to disclose through this initiative, and they, for example, received a 71% response from their suppliers in 2020. Similarly, other companies like BT, Ericsson, Telia are among the founders of the 1.5 degree centigrade supply chain leaders initiative, which supports SMEs and with their emissions disclosures and target setting. There's also Apple's supplier clean energy program, which was launched to encourage its supply chain to move to a renewable energy by 2020. Over 100 suppliers are participating in this. And also Nokia is another great example where they've agreed with key suppliers that they should also achieve net zero emissions by 2030. Next slide, please. And digital companies are also leaders in green energy procurement, as well as being quite leading innovators in initiatives and tools to drive and really scale renewable energy markets. the ICT sector accounted for about half of the global corporate energy procurement in 2020, and 6 digital companies were among the top 10 of the world's largest corporate purchases of renewable energy. So digital companies are playing a big role here and have a lot to offer. Next slide, please. In this left chart, you can see that there's 13 companies which pay for 100% renewable energy. There's actually only 4 of them which are getting it at all times. Hence, it's quite difficult for them. They do have zero scope to market emissions. Companies like Google have been a pioneer in trying to solve this problem when it procures about 100% renewable electricity for its operations, but it finds that only about 67% is actually delivered to its data centers on an hourly basis. This was in 2020. The company is committed to achieving carbon-free energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where every kilowatt hour of power consumption is matched by carbon-free electricity production on the grid, where electricity is consumed. So the company is one of the founding members of the 24/7 Carbon-Free Energy Compact, which is an initiative coordinated by the United Nations. Next slide, please. So of the companies assessed in our report, 16 were reported to be carbon neutral by 2020. All but 2 are from Europe or the United States, and most of these companies are using voluntary offsets or for their remaining emissions. Though there's debate about voluntary carbon offsets, they are recognised by the Kyoto Protocol, and offsets have an impact in low and middle income countries through investment in renewables, reforestation, and related initiatives such as clean cookstoves. And pay-as-you-go solar was also seem to be an important, a common topic in some of the ESGs we found. Next slide, please. So in terms of, we also looked at the differences in low and middle income countries, and almost a third of assessed companies are headquartered in lower middle and upper middle income economies or LMIs. Also, a number of other digital companies have operations in LMIs, with the bulk of emissions in these coming from Chinese headquartered companies. Many LMIs face challenges with access to grids and also reliability. So as a result, mobile base stations, for example, require their own generators, and these are often diesel powered. Efforts are being made by some companies to convert generators to solar or connect them to the grid. For instance, the telecom operator Telenor has subsidiaries in 4 Asian middle-income countries, and they are transitioning to diesel-powered mobile base stations to solar in line with its goal of reducing 50% carbon emissions for their Asian operations by 2030. And another challenge is energy markets tend to be more restrictive than those in high middle income nations. And we believe that unless LMIs open up their energy markets, they will find it increasingly difficult to attract foreign investment from major tech companies, which we were looking at in the report. So next slide, please. We also looked at what digital technologies themselves are doing. So the report looked at how these were driving emission reductions within the company's value chain, but also across, of course, other sectors. Examples include, there are many, so just a couple of highlights. IoT sensors were commonly being placed in heating, ventilation, and air conditioning sensor systems, and that enables energy reductions. Blockchain is facilitating renewable trade on distributed energy networks. AI-based techniques are producing more precise forecasting of wind and solar production, and robots are also being used to disassemble digital devices to extract raw materials, which can then be reused. And of course, we've been the past couple of years, we've seen apps being increasingly used with video conferencing, and these are driving down some emission scopes as well. Next slide, please. So digital technologies play an important role in enablement and decarbonisation. So the use of digital services contribute to avoided emissions, and it's sometimes referred to as Scope 4, while all types of digital companies help to enable emission reductions through their products and services. Arguably, telecom operators have the largest enablement impact by providing the underlying network connectivity. They were 7 times larger than their operational emissions and more than 1.6 times their total footprint. So, of course, enablement should not be used as an excuse for companies to delay reducing their own footprint emissions, but there is also a need for a standard methodology to helping calculate this, and I'm sure Pernilla will mention it a bit more, but ITU is looking more into this topic as well. Next slide, please. So some digital companies are moving from carbon neutrality from voluntary offsets to net zero with carbon removal. Digital companies have announced investment of over 4 billion in carbon removal initiatives. One of them, for example, is Microsoft, which is aiming not only to eliminate its emissions footprint by 2030, but also remove all historical carbon emissions since its founding by 2050. In its last fiscal year, it bought 1.1 million tonnes of carbon removal, including being the world's largest purchase. This was the world's largest purchase. So projects including rainforestation, biomass sequestration, and direct air capture were being funded by the company in partnership with Carbon Direct. It has also published carbon dioxide removal guidance for procurement projects. Next slide, please. So let's dive into a bit more of the results. Next slide. So this slide shows the operational emissions and electricity used for the assessed digital companies. They accounted for about 0.7% of global location-based emissions, and market-based Scope 1 and 2 emissions are 18% smaller at 425 terawatt hours of electricity. This accounts for a higher share of the global total at 1.6%. Almost a third of electricity in the companies was purchased renewable in 2020, and the figures do not include total company footprints due to not all companies reporting this, as well as the possibility of double counting. Next slide, please. And just very briefly, these charts show the results based on the region of company headquarters. You can see that East Asian headquartered companies make a third less emissions. They accounted for about 60% of the group's emissions and half of electricity use. And the reason for this is they were lagging behind in their peers, and they really need to step up in terms of, especially related to the renewable energy markets, which they're being involved in. Next slide, please. So we assess the companies on quality and completeness of their data, their performance, and how ambitious their targets were. 16 of the companies received an A grade, and all were headquartered in Europe or the US, and they are spread across 3 different digital industries, and emissions disclosures, targets, and performance of all these companies serve as a best practice for other companies to follow. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, because I know I'm running over time, we saw digital companies and technologies are having a notable impact on reducing emissions in other sectors, but standard guidance for measuring this is needed. We saw earlier companies headquartered in East Asia account for a share of emissions and electricity use of tech companies. So decarbonisation needs to be speeded up in that region, and third, developing countries are lagging behind in liberalising their energy markets, and governments really need to expand the scope for renewables, or they may find they will have difficulty attracting foreign investment. And I will, next slide, and conclude on with this food for thought, and would like to also thank Pernilla, who is the next speaker. She was a great asset to our report and the various insightful comments. So thank you very much to everyone, and I'll pass it back to you, Lords. Thanks.
Thank you, Rosie, for that very comprehensive taste of the report. So for anyone who's interested to deep dive into the details, you can see the link in the chat. Let me first introduce all our wonderful panel speakers who we really appreciate as having joined us today. I'll start with Ms. Pernilla Bergmark. Pernilla, many of you know, is a principal researcher for ICT sustainability impacts at Ericsson. Pernilla's research interests include methodology development and assessments, and she's also active in ITU standardization as a co-rapporteur of ITU SG 5Q9, as well as the co-author of the Exponential Roadmap for 1.5 degree aligned climate action. Following Pernilla, we have Mr. Christoph van Horbelt. I hope I said that correctly. Christoph has been working in Ørsted for 7.5 years. For the last 5 years, he has been working with corporate customers and has been leading PPA transactions with Covestro and Amazon. Today, he's leading a team that develops bespoke solutions to corporate decarbonization challenges. Then we have Ms. Julia Mayer. Is a sustainable IT engineer at ADEME. ADEME is the French Environment Agency. Julia is in charge of sustainable IT at the Circular Economy Department of the French Agency for Ecological Transition, and an expert in methodologies for assessing the environmental impacts of the network, data centers, and cloud services. And last but not least is Mr. David Jensen, who is the Digital Transformation Lead at the United Nations Environment Program. David is the coordinator of the Digital Transformation Program at the UNEP, and he's also UNEP's focal point for the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability, or CODES, within the Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. So we welcome all the panel speakers warmly, and Pernilla, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for your warm welcome. And I think we go directly to the next slide. I'm very glad to be here and look forward to discuss this report. So I think I start from the report itself. We have been working for a long time in our own research based on collecting a width of data. We see that often the data underpinning studies is not that extensive. So we really welcome that you provide this data set in this accessible format. And also we fully acknowledge the effort which lies behind collecting this kind of data, because it's not like you could go to a database and fetch it, but it's provided in different formats, and you have to double check and go through a lot of information. So very massive undertaking, so impressive. But some things that stood out to me looking at this was really how you brought forward regional differences. That I think is not something that has been very much discussed, and I think it's very good to get an eye on that. Then I also think another thing was the importance and the challenges related to the procurement of low carbon electricity. So I think it was good that you framed your results in relation to the challenges, or the other way around. And then also you bring forward the importance and challenges around scope 3. So I think it's very important, and of course the quality of those is the scope 3 reporting, as we put forward in reports, is differing a lot. Next slide, please. Yeah, Okay, so I thought before going into some further details, just remind us of the effort, the scale of the effort that we need to pursue. So it's not only about getting towards net zero, but we need to halve global emissions by 2030, again by 2040. And this is a kind of a pace that we need to deliver on, and we are far from there, as we know. So I think your report is very timely from that sense to see where we are as an ICT sector. Next, please. I was asked to provide since your overall results referred to the companies which were included in the study rather than the overall sector as such, I wanted to present this slide, which shows the development of the sector from 2000 until 2020. And these are the 1.4% that we refer to as a overall life cycle carbon footprint of the sector is the one that we use in ITU as our baseline for our trajectories. And as you can see in this picture, the sector grew a lot from the perspective of carbon emissions until 2010-ish, and then it has been quite stable over the last decade. But of course, the challenge is that we now, under this decade, shall halve the emissions also of this sector, and while we see this exponential data growth. Next, please. I have double affiliations here today. So I'm also representing the ITU, the standardization branch of ITU, the SG5, which is focused on, among other things, especially on the climate. So we are working on different standards in relation to this topic, and especially in my question, we are looking into how to assess these things. So next, please. So the first one I wanted to bring forward, which has a connection to the theme of the report, is really our decarbonization trajectories that we will develop jointly between ITU, GSMA, GESI, and the Science Based Target Initiative. So they roughly talk about the halving of emissions of the sector. It's a bit different between different parts of the sector. And we also have provided a standard on how to deliver on net zero. What is the definition and what are companies supposed to do? So have a look if I think you can find them useful. Please, next. These estimates that we are providing for the trajectory are underpinned by this standard, the L1450, which is a standard and the methodology for assessing the overall carbon footprint of the sector, coming from a different perspective compared to this report, which comes from the company perspective, while this comes from the technology perspective, so from the networks, the data centers, and the devices. Next, please. Our main work, which Rosie referred to in her presentation, the main work item that we have open now, and we hope to consent in this meeting that is ongoing right now, is for publication during 2022, is really a standard on how to assess the enablement effect. And it's a complex topic because it's always a contrafactual assessment between a reference scenario and a ICT solution scenario, which cannot exist at the same time. So there are many assumptions involved. So you have to have a strict standard to make that in a credible way. Next. But I was asked to come a bit from the company perspective, but also to talk a bit about how we can reduce ICT sector footprint. And I think what we see in our trajectory is there are 4 main things. So one is to go renewable, as you say in your report. And we see that 80% of the carbon emissions of the sector are actually related to the use of electricity, independent of where you are in the value chain. So very important. Then, of course, we have to build systems in a smart way, and we have to phase out old equipment when it comes emissions to network and probably also data centers. For embodied emissions, for user devices, the embodied emissions are also very important because that's a large share. So that brings us to the circular economy. And of course, the collaboration is key to reach success. Next, please. Okay, but I especially just wanted to put your attention to the work by the UNFCCC in the climate action pathways, where there is actually a pathway specifically for the ICT and mobile sector. Please click twice. So next, yeah, and one more, thank you. And that is presented in different time horizons and for different groups of actors. So this is a rich material to dig into. And I know there are different initiatives in making the sector greener. So I would especially like to mention the Codes initiative, which I'm sure that David will guide you through later. Next. So very quickly about Ericsson. This is our carbon footprint. So what you can see here is that the portfolio use is almost everything. Then we have the supply chain, and then follows their own activities, though they seem insignificant in comparison with the portfolio use. That is representing our operation in the most of the world's countries and 100,000 people roughly employed. So it's not insignificant from that perspective. Next, please. Important to stress is from the ambition perspective, net zero perspective, we have an ambition to be net zero by 2040, but we think more importantly is what we do with the next few years. Of course, the long-term perspective is important as well, so that we have set up quite strict targets for the 2030 perspective, and I will not dig into that too much because I think I'm running out of time. Next, please. But we have set up different beyond the targets, or to reach the target. The important thing is of course the activities, and I won't have the opportunity to go into all of them, but halving emissions from using our portfolio is we have several actions. You can go to next. And also for the supply chain, different activities, and next. And also in the own emissions. So it goes from everything to reducing energy consumption in facilities to fleet and even the commuting of employees. Next. So that was just illustrating that there is a width of actions that the ICT companies can undertake to reduce their emission. So just to finish off and connect back to the report. So when reading this, and I had the opportunity to be part of your review process, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and connecting with the question 9 and ST5. So there are future opportunities as I see it. So I think the first one is there is an opportunity to investigate if we could have further alignment on the boundary setting of the sector and categorization and so on. I think also there would be an opportunity to provide some further details on the sources. So you have all the sources in the document, so it's a very thorough work from that perspective, but that could be pinpointed even further. I think there would be a benefit in having a more clear distinction between carbon neutrality commitments and net zero commitments from companies in the report, to have them in separate categories, because net zero is a much more well-defined concept and also a greater undertaking as I see it. And then there would also be benefit from more clear distinction on when companies are committing to carbon neutrality and so on, what is what are the magnitude of reduction versus compensations in their targets. So that would be good in the analysis. And also to leverage on these insights that you have gained during this process on the different report format and so on would provide important input to standardization, and also the experiences of the data collection would be beneficial, because I think that would be a great a great opportunity for ITU to establish a database on the ICT sector carbon footprint, because there is a lot of speculations around that. So that would really be helpful. And I think we have a great opportunity to collaborate closer in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Cornelia, and we'd like to take this opportunity once again to thank you for your inputs and feedback on the early drafts of the report. I'd like to welcome in Christoph to share his thoughts.
Cool, thanks a lot. Let me just try to share my screen before I share my thoughts. I hope this works. Can you see it? Okay, then thanks a lot for having me. I'm really grateful to be here, first of all, and thanks a lot for a great piece of work. I also got a peek into the report over the last few days, and think it is a fantastic and very insightful work. I'm from Ørsted, and usually when we do these things, most people do not know who we are. So I'll spend a little bit of time on telling you a little bit about us. Ørsted is first and foremost a company that has a vision, and our vision is let's create a world that runs entirely on green energy. That's not the simplest slogan. There's definitely people who had a lot better ways to shorter ways to say what they wanted to say, but it still states a very, very clear commitment. I think the most important thing, and this is also why I'm really glad to be here, is let's. It doesn't say I create a world that runs entirely on green energy, or we create a world that runs entirely on green energy, but it invites everyone to take part of this. And I think the report shows that a whole industry can make so many differences, and it's really great to see that there's also so many of you who have joined today who obviously are taking direct actions to this. What is our direct role in all of this? We also have a big ambition to become the world's leading green energy major. We are a global leader in offshore wind, and have an ambition to reach 30 gigawatts of installed capacity globally, which is really a major ambition. We are also active in onshore renewables. We have solar PV and also onshore wind, but we also provide bioenergy in our home turf in Denmark, and are also, because it was mentioned that negative emissions are part of this, also working on carbon capture technologies to even create a negative impact on carbon emissions. And then we are building up a platform for becoming a major player in renewable hydrogen and green fuels as well. So what I'm talking about today is giving you hopefully a pretty broad perspective on what companies can do. Very quickly on where we do this. This map, certainly when I started working in Ørsted, was smaller, and it has been growing very fast. But just in a nutshell, obviously we come from Europe. We have a pretty big operations in the United Kingdom. We have again a platform that is growing in the United States for offshore wind and onshore wind, and also expanding into hydrogen slowly. But we also have a foothold in Taiwan, and actually offices in Japan, Vietnam, and also developing some assets in South Korea. And what we actually see there is from the perspective of renewable energy buying, that's probably the most challenging area for many of the ICT companies to procure renewable energy due to the availability of it, but also due to regulatory boundaries that have been identified. I wanted to basically talk a little bit about PPAs or power purchase agreements, because what I also read in the report is that is obviously a measure of choice in many ways, and I think also times will change. But just to give you a background from a renewable energy developer, you have to make like a massive upfront investment, and you basically don't have any variable costs going forward. So what you actually need to make your project bankable is that visibility of revenue in the future, and that certainty. So when and it was really ICT companies for a long time really leading the way, and I think still doing it. They became leaders in sustainability as well, and wanted to really kind of make a change in the world. And this created actually a lot of certainty for many projects. Rosie showed this graph about kind of all the megawatts that the Microsofts and Amazons of these worlds have bought, and that is really equivalent to numerous projects that have gotten this kind of revenue certainty for the future and were able to commit to being built, which is really a great success, and it is really great to see that that the industry is still going ahead with this. There is always a direct link to a specific asset, which makes it obviously much more complex to look for the right asset. But I think also many companies have done it in the past, and it has been really successful. There is and PPAs will remain kind of a massive lever to create more renewable energy capacity in the world, basically driving down global emissions, and obviously also greening the supply or energy supply of companies, not only from the ICT industry, but also many others. But the PPAs that we knew will change. It is still kind of the vehicle to transport this risk mitigation, but the design will change. And we have heard the term 24/7, but I wanted to basically put this a little bit into my own perspective. Previously, it was enough to basically say, I buy the equivalent of my annual demand with renewable power. And you would basically look in the end of the year, have these assets that I bought power from produced enough, and if it matched my demand, then I could basically claim the carbon reductions for this. And this was for a very long time also sufficient. It from a system perspective, it was the biggest need was to push out more capacity, making it easy to bring more capacity online and increasing the renewable energy content in the system. We have been so successful with this that going forward, we need to look at much more at the profile, not just anymore how much volume was produced in a year, but actually look at, okay, so how much was produced at a given time. The graph that we see in the middle is not the most intuitive, but basically what it says is how much percentage of time across a year was renewable energy basically producing more or less than there was demand. And we moved basically from a left-hand side where we had kind of a lot of hours with full production to the right-hand side where there was basically no production from renewable energy. And this is just illustrative of a situation that we will see much more in the future, where we have a lot of production that actually exceeds demand, but also where we have numerous hours where we don't have enough. And this is really where kind of these 24/7 ideas come in, and where it's important that we also embrace this and create the solutions for this to ultimately move to the far right-hand side, to have a perfect match between basically supply and demand at all times. And this is really what we are also committed to when we say, let's make the world run entirely on green energy, because this is the only way we do it. And we applaud basically the ICT companies that lead the way in that direction, really. So that's it from me. I hope I haven't exceeded my time too much, but thanks for listening.
Thank you, Christoph. It was a really very interesting, detailed look into your business and how you have helped facilitate the greening of digital companies, which is what this webinar is about. I'd like to call on Julia next. If you can put on your screen share.
Thank you. I will try to share my screen. Up. Do you see my screen? Yeah, perfect. So thank you very much for the invitation to this webinar. I'm also really glad to be here, and thank you for the work you've done. So yeah, I'm Julia Meyer and I work at ADEM. Few words on what we do in ADEM. So it's a public institution under the supervision of French Ministry of Ecological Transition. And we participate in implementing public policies in the fields of environment, energy, and sustainable development. So basically, we help companies, local authorities, and the general public to progress in their environmental approach by providing expertise and also financing projects. So I will try to give an example of how the regulation and the public policies can help also companies to monitor and reduce their environmental impact. So as you said, the digital sector allows the development of powerful tools, and we can all see each other at a distance today thanks to it. However, it has a significant impact. Our latest study at the French scale showed that it represents 2.5 of GHG emissions and approximately 10% of the French electricity. In France, there is a real will of French legislators today to produce regulations to control this impact and to push French economy towards a circular economy. So in the anti-waste law for circular economy, what we call the AGEC law, the information for customers about the environmental impact of products and services that they buy is important, and also the incitation of developers, manufacturers, and retailers to improve the environmental performance of their products and service is also really important in this law. So there is in particular the implementation of the reparability index to be communicated by sellers of a certain type of digital equipment, which maybe you have heard about. And there is also the implementation of methodologies, one methodology at least, developed by ADEM to inform the customers of internet service providers of their carbon impact, carbon impact linked due to their data consumption on fixed and mobile French networks. Fixed means the ADSL fiber extra, and mobile the 3G, 4G, 5Gs. So for this methodology, we wanted to work on an environmental labeling standard based on a life cycle analysis and multi-criteria methodologies. Why is that? Because it is important because 35% of the impact of digital equipment, at least in France, is linked to the embodied emissions, so the scope 3. And as you mentioned, Rosie, it's really important that more and more companies report the scope 3 part of their emission. And it's also important to not only look at the GHG emission, because, for example, the study we conducted with ARCEP, the French agency for regulating the post and telecom, we showed that taking into account other indicators, particularly minerals and fossil resources, is just as important as the carbon indicator. Just a small example on that: to manufacture a smartphone is 200 kilograms of materials that must be mobilized, and out of 50 of the metal present in a smartphone, only 10 of it can be recycled, at least if we can collect the smartphone. So in the methodology standards for the environment, for the environmental assessment of internet service provision, the carbon footprint of the internet data consumption correspond to the carbon footprint of all the equipment making up to the fixed and mobile telecommunication network, and of the boxes in case of the fixed network. And we include the definition of the functional unit, the scope of calculation, and also the rules for allocating the impact, because some equipments are shared between ISPs, and also some network equipment are also used for both fixed and mobile network. And we also define in this methodology the impact data to be taken into account based on the life cycle analysis of equipment made by manufacturers. And actually this also is compatible with the ITU 1410. So yeah, it's really important to work on those standards that are common for companies to be able to communicate on the same parameters and with the same hypothesis to evaluate the impact of a product or a service. So just to mention that in parallel to this methodology, we are also working with voluntary actors on similar methodologies for data centers and cloud services. And as you mentioned, Christophe, we also define in that kind of methodology for data centers and cloud services how we should take into account PPAs in the same ways for all companies that apply these methodologies for the electricity mix number. And yes, just to maybe add one more thing, there is quite a will of the French public authority to generalize these common methodologies. So the law to reduce the environmental footprint of digital technology in 2021 provide the same experimentation as the one for internet service provision, but for the video on demand services. So we will work on methodology, a common methodology on that. Actually, there is also a really big need to work also on methodologies to assess what Pernilla called and Rosie mentioned, the ICT enablement effect. I think it's really important to work on common methodology to evaluate that in different sectors, how ICT can help reduce the emissions of different sectors. And I think it's absolutely necessary to use multi-criteria and the life cycle analysis on the service to check. Like, for example, you mentioned the blockchain that can help to reduce the emission of with the production of electricity. So it's really important for a blockchain service, for example, to define how we evaluate the impact that is reduced thanks to this technology in the same way, with the same parameters and the same data. So yeah, actually, to conclude, I'd just say that those methodology and also the work you've done are not possible without the active participation of actors. And so there is a great need to mobilize all the actors, especially on opening data to calculate the impact of the digital services. And I think it's really great that with this report the big work was done on the data collection sharing because it's really helpful. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. So the WBA is very happy to have been partnering with them on our climate work. So thank you for joining us. And before we end, we've saved the best for last. I will say, David, could you take the floor?
Sure, happy to. Best for last. That's a pretty tall order, but I'll do my best. Give me 1 second to share my screen.
That means that you have to keep very strictly to your time, or even less than that, David.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Of course, the internet gremlins have decided that they don't want me to share my screen. Give me another couple seconds to try to sort this out.
Do you want me to share it, David? Because I've got it open.
You know what? Maybe because we're so short on time, I'll just speak. I won't use slides if that's okay.
That's perfect.
That's okay. Basically, I just want to say, obviously, the UN Environment Program welcomes the report. This is a great contribution to the sector. I think what's important for colleagues to understand is that member states have recently given the UN Environment Program a new 4-year mandate to start looking at this question of digital technologies and environmental sustainability. So we are now building up a new program which has basically 3 pillars inside it. The first pillar is really looking at this question of data and building up a digital ecosystem of data that can monitor the planet in real time and begin to monitor some of these major environmental challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So we're building up the capacity to do that global level monitoring, to monitor SDGs, to monitor environmental agreement, and to make progress much more transparent and real time. Those are the 2 big goals there. Then second, once we have all that data, the key question is, how do we start to plug it into the digital economy to begin to influence markets, supply chains, and consumer behaviors? So how do we get data on sustainability and data on some of our key environmental challenges to plug into the algorithms, to plug into the platforms of the digital space to begin shaping behaviors, shaping investments, and informing supply chain decisions? So that's pillar number 2. And then pillar 3 is really all about building capacities of governments to harness these tools to accelerate their national development goals and to build national innovation ecosystems. So this is really all about capacity building, sharing best practices, sharing lessons to really help governments and stakeholders deploy these tools to achieve their environmental goals. So those are the 3 pillars that we're working on inside UNEP. And as I said, this program was only recently launched, and it's lasting from about 2022 to 2025. So that's number 1. Then the second message is, a lot of these kinds of changes are systemic in nature, as was mentioned, and it's going to require collaboration across all sectors, right? Public, private, civil society, academia. And this is where the CODES group is now coming in. So the CODES stands for the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability. This is a track within the Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Roadmap. And this is really all about how do we start to bring together environmental sustainability and digital transformation into a common vision and a twin transition. And so the CODES Coalition launched about a year ago. There are about 1,000 stakeholders in the coalition, and we've gone through an extensive bottom-up co-design process to really answer this question. How do we bring these 2 mega trends together? And how do we begin to harness digital technologies to accelerate environmental sustainability globally? So that was the question. We went through about 12 months of co-creation, co-design, and we recently launched this action plan for a sustainable planet in the digital age. This was launched at Stockholm Plus 50. And really, in a nutshell, the action plan talks about 3 fundamental shifts that have to happen to bring these areas together. And the first shift is really all about enabling alignment, right? Bringing together these two shifts by creating an enabling environment, creating the standards, creating the training, creating all of the coalitions that are needed to bring them together. The second shift is then all about mitigating the environmental impacts of digital technologies. This was talked about in other sessions, but how do we begin to mitigate the energy requirements, the e-waste? How do we start to address fake news and misinformation about the environment? How do we deal with polarization and the digital divide? So the shift 2 is really all about mitigation. And then the final shift is really all about accelerating innovation to use digital tools to accelerate sustainability. And this is really all about the enablement factor that was discussed by Pramila. So how do we begin to enable sustainability with digital tools and technologies? So those are the 3 areas that the action plan goes into. And then basically it proposes 9 impact initiatives. And these are basically global scale impact initiatives that are aiming for systemic level change that will require multi-stakeholder collaboration in order to go forward. So I don't really have time to get into all 9. What I would recommend colleagues to look at is the report, and in particular dive into those 9 impact initiatives, because what we are now doing is translating each of those 9 into a self-standing work stream. And we're looking for organizations that can lead each of those initiatives and organizations that can also support each of those initiatives. So I'd suggest people to go to the CODES website at www.sparkblue.org/join codes, and there you'll find the report. You'll find a stakeholder mapping of about 240 stakeholders working in the sector, and then you'll also find the 9 impact initiatives. And this is basically a call to action to join one or more of these impact initiatives and contribute to the kind of collective action we need to take them all forward. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. And it was really a good point to stop at, which means that we need to think about action and how we work together. And that's really the spirit of SDG 17. And that's what we are here for. So we're very happy to collaborate with ITU and all of you in the audience and all our speakers, and we can drive progress on this agenda together. That's very we're very appreciative of the insights from our panel speakers, and I'll end with some key takeaways from the report and from our discussion. We've actually learned that digital companies have an important impact on different dimensions of climate change, including in the race to eliminate harmful emissions and achieve carbon neutral operations. And digital companies consume vast amounts of electricity, but a number are already early adopters of innovative and sustainable mechanisms which help drive and scale renewable energy markets. So it's a balance. Number of companies are also leaders in green energy procurement. At the same time, there are noticeable differences among the digital companies in their approach to decarbonization. Some are committed to eliminating their entire carbon footprint before 2030, while others, especially some of the biggest emitters, are moving slowly. The existence of a geographical divide is evident from the company assessments. Companies leading the emissions reporting performance are from often North America and Europe compared to others. East Asian headquartered companies use relatively little renewable energies, a lot of work to be done there. They have delayed adopting climate-friendly strategies and will largely not reach carbon neutrality until after 2050, or around 2 decades later than companies headquartered in other regions. Studies are emerging that show that the significant impact ICTs are having on reducing emissions in other sectors. There's enablement is now a calculated metric for some digital companies, showing how use of their products and services are avoiding emissions. And this includes broadband-enabled home working, online conferencing, and smart metering. COVID-19 actually accelerated the use of video conferencing, which we are benefiting from today, lowering travel-induced emissions. As the world becomes more digitalized, emissions avoidance from ICT products and services will grow. So developing countries face particularly challenges, including lack of access to the grid in rural areas, dirty grids, and frequent outages. And governments need to create a favorable environment for clean energy, allowing renewable energy providers, for example, eliminating taxes on renewable products, unbundling grids, and allowing on-site use of renewables. So most of the digital companies covered in this report publish the basic metrics needed to analyze their operational climate performance. However, there is a wide gap in quality and quantity. More emissions reporting is needed at the country level, and guidance is also needed on product use and enablement emissions, as several companies seem to be claiming this, resulting in double counting. So there's still plenty of work ahead of us to ensure digital companies continue to eliminate emissions and reach carbon neutral net zero climate targets. The data collected and shared publicly by digital companies provides a very promising basis on which to continue to build and strive towards a more green digital economy. And I would like to end by taking this opportunity to thank you all for joining us today. And if you have any further questions about our climate change work, be in touch. We will also start discussions on how to continue our work on tracking emissions and climate commitments. So please reach out, let us know if this is something you're interested in and want to be a part of. And with that, I thank everyone. Have a good day or a good evening wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye-bye.